Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good evening. Welcome everyone to the third panel at this very rich conference full of interesting ideas. We will be dealing with similar questions to those that were addressed in the previous panels by the previous speakers. And I would like to now present our guests for this third panel. It is Lenka Víchová, an expert in Ukraine studies. She focuses on Ukrainian modern history and is an editor of Ukrainský žurnál. She is also part of an NGO Team for Ukraine, whose mission is practical support for Ukrainian civic society and the professionalization of the NGO sector and the security services. Our second guest is Ksenia Poluektova-Krimer, who studied Jewish studies and history in Budapest, Jerusalem, and in the Michigan University in the US. She also worked in the memorial at Yad Vashem in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and her research addresses history, memory, and museum representations of the Shoah, as well as the Russian society, historical politics, and culture. After the Russian aggression started, she quickly left Russia for Germany, where she now works in Potsdam. Our third guest is Jan Vevera, the head of the Psychiatric Clinic of the Faculty of Medicine in Pilsen. He teaches psychiatry and medical psychology. He also worked in the army of the Czech Republic, and he spent a year serving in Afghanistan. He also was the main military expert on psychiatry, and he co-founded the Vitry Center of Excellence, which carries out the transdisciplinary research on violence, trauma, and justice. And the last person here is me, Jakub Szántó. I work for the Czech television, and I carried out a number of journalistic missions to Ukraine, both during this conflict and previous times. To begin with, I would like to ask Lenka Víchová to open the debate. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy for the opportunity to speak here, and also I am very thankful to be able to hear from the previous speakers who were really amazing. I'm not sure if I am the right person to speak here during the third panel, because I am a Ukrainian studies expert, so I don't always study evil. However, given what we have heard in the previous panels and what we were thinking about in the context of the evil taking place in Ukraine between two nations, I would like to focus on the evil we are not always aware exists. It exists in ourselves. It is part of us, because this conflict didn't start from scratch. It has its prehistory. When I was considering what to speak about, I thought of a moment when I was reading a book. This book was titled or dealt with the life, culture, and background of Mahatma Gandhi. I was intrigued by one passage which described the sati ritual. During this ritual, a deceased man is burnt together with his family, his living relatives. And there was a memory I read, I think from Mahatma Gandhi, about Indian authorities, Indian men protested against banning this ritual. They said that the British authorities prevented them from sticking to their traditions, and that this sati ritual was part of Indian traditions. Then a British representative allegedly said, "We are not banning these traditions. You can continue doing them. We just tell you that if you make another person die, you will also be punished by the death penalty." And then I think Gandhi said that men decided not to stick to those traditions because it was a question of life and death for them, not just a question of lives of women. So this really struck me because I appreciated that British sarcasm. Then in 2014, I realized that we also practice this sacrifice ritual. Because what is it if not sacrifice? If we abandon people living in a certain territory, and we did that without so much as blushing. We pardoned that. We excused that because of Russian propaganda. We said that the Crimea had always been Russian, just because it was once stolen already in the 1973. I know that we could say that we cannot save the whole world, but if we stick to this logic, it could be the same as in India. In India, they said, why should we care about widows and children? This was the same logic. And this made me think that now, this December, we will be celebrating a nation that is 100 years old, and we could be speaking about the Soviet Union, which has this tradition of occupying another territory, holding referendums, and shedding blood. It was not the first time when they annexed Crimea in 2014. The same happened in 1939, when they did the very same thing in the Baltic nations. And I would just like to say that Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia were among the first states that recognized the existence of the Soviet Union, although they had to face similar things as those that happened in 2014 in Crimea. We have heard here today that Russians and Ukrainians have lived in peace and brotherhood for a long time. That is not quite true. Similar things to what we have been witnessing since the 24th of February have been taking place even before that. We have just realized the scope of the atrocities thanks to the technologies at our service, because we are able to see things. Previously, there was a conflict in Ukraine, an artificial famine that was created in Ukraine because of protests taking place in the countryside there. When stories about this traveled the world, Walter Durant from the New York Times went to Moscow and said that nothing like that was happening. Then in the year 2002, Ukrainians tried to ask the Pulitzer Prize Foundation to withdraw the prize from this journalist for this flaw report, but the foundation refused to do so, claiming that he had received this prize for different articles, for different work. But I would like to point out to you what he did. He denied what happened in Ukraine. He said there is no famine in Ukraine, in Ukrainian countryside. Simply, Ukrainians are not eating so much in the countryside. However, there were about 4 million deaths in the countryside at that time. So I want to point out what is happening in the Western civilizations. I am persuaded that evil is everywhere around us, but it is not always so strong. We make it stronger by being ignorant, by being blind, by mercantile interests we pursue, by economic or political interests. I always remember Oleg Sentsov and his words, and you definitely know him as a political prisoner, but I also think that he was a detainee during the Russian-Ukrainian war, and he said that great treacheries often stem from small fears. He spoke about prisoners of war who, during tortures, were willing to sign anything. But this also applies to other things. We have been doing small favors to the Russian regime for years, and this contributed to the fact that a country that undertook a genocide against a sovereign nation dared to do so. It's not only a political annihilation, it's also different forms of attacks, as was the case in 1939 and so on. This regime was never punished. Which brings me again to this sati ritual. Of course, it didn't end in 1829. But in 1829, we have seen the beginning of its end, because law was being applied. We started to apply the law. We said what was evil and what will be the punishment. Thank you.
The word to Ksenia. Krimer, please, your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for having me here. It's a great honor and privilege, and I would like to congratulate once again this year's laureates and extend my gratitude to Evgenia also for the fascinating conversations we had a chance to have yesterday, and add a disclaimer that a lot of what I'm going to say today might rub the wrong way and is going to go against the grain of her message and Vladimir's message, because I guess that she and Vladimir come from a place of hopefulness and idealism. I come from a place of bitterness and disappointment, so take it with that framework in mind. I'm sorry, academics are notoriously bad at keeping, to the requirements of length and duration, so I decided to just sketch 4 bullet points to help us map the conversation about the roots of violence and the cases and the causes of the ethical and moral collapse, which I think is evident in Russian society today, which is based on my recent research and work on violence in Russian society. So my first point is that collectively Russians have gone through, committed and witnessed some of the most bloody wars and some of the most horrendous crimes in the 20th century. Several bloody wars, including a civil war, famines, and 7 decades of Soviet terror. Such scale of bloodshed banalizes violence, makes human lives cheap. It also fosters a certain habitus, indifference, passivity, apathy in the face of brutality, and chronic lack of solidarity. But Putin's regime, I believe, also worked to compound this historical legacy by consistent depoliticization, cynicism, isolationism, a tribal division of the world into us and them, which might help us explain the current public attitudes to the war in Ukraine. My second point is about violence and its importance and centrality to Russian society. I think that violence in Russia has become some sort of social clay, an identity-making tool that provides cohesion and keeps social structures in place. It saturates every pore of Russian existence, of Russian life, and is mostly unpunished, from families to schools, to psychiatric hospitals and maternity wards, to the police precincts, and of course the army. But it also has an emancipating function. I think the state has, we can agree that the state has by now effectively abolished all the rights and liberties, and political representation is non-existent. But ordinary citizens, ordinary Russians, in their private lives have full control over the bodies and lives of their loved ones, or loved ones in quotation marks, of their family members. So there is no control over your own life, but a lot of control in your family domain. And they enjoy near impunity when it comes to domestic violence because it's been decriminalized in the country. And I think, similarly, Russian war crimes in Ukraine, from manslaughter to torture, from rape to looting, because Russia seems hell-bent on committing every possible crime in the book, enable Russian military to experience lawlessness and defiance of norms, legal and ethical, in emancipating terms. In a way, it's a liberation from shame and civility, which is conceived of as a form of authenticity and freedom, the only one form of authenticity and freedom available to these people, accessible to them. My third point is, what is the incubator of that violence? It's the penitentiary system that houses the biggest prison population in Europe and has inherited key features of the Gulag: random brutality, systematic abuse and humiliation inflicted on the inmates by both the administration and the hardened criminals that collaborate with the administration. Prison experience is extremely prevalent in the country, with almost 500,000 people currently behind bars. By 2007, according to one report and one calculation, approximately 18.2% of the population, entire population, including babies and old people, had had a criminal record. That's a staggering number. From prison and penal colonies, this violence seeps back into society, into normal life, in quotation marks, informing language, behaviors, and attitudes, including those operating in the institutions of power. I don't need to comment on Putin's criminal argot and his love of that kind of language. Putin's regime, we can say, is criminal not only because it has committed horrendous crimes and continues to do so, both in the country and in Ukraine and outside the country. But it is criminal because it's governed by criminal concepts, what Russians call понятия, concepts that have replaced law and morality effectively. Cynicism, hierarchical thinking, veneration of physical force, patriarchal machismo, and again, violence. And my final point about the ethical collapse, which I think we need to discuss as well. I think Russian society manifests a profound moral bankruptcy in its reactions to the ongoing war in Ukraine and Putin's regime in general. We know very well the conformist attitudes of the culture makers co-opted by the regime, of the church, which fails to raise its voice in condemnation of anything that this regime has committed and continues to commit. And these discourses, these opinions in quotation marks, are fairly well known and not really interesting. But the discourses circulating amidst the so-called liberal intelligentsia or liberal opposition are taking shape as we speak, and I find them also extremely problematic, and they're much less studied. And they are too marked by striking ethical numbness, narcissistic indifference to the suffering of the Ukrainians, and this obsessive vying for the status of the main victim of the crisis. You might have heard Russians are the new Jews. The discourse goes, banned from entering the EU, just like the Jews who were banned from entering America or Cuba, the passengers of the doomed St. Louis, that carried Jews from Europe on the eve of the Holocaust. And I am quoting, this is not what I'm not making this up. So Russians complain that they have been canceled, discriminated, or treated unjustly and unfairly. And this obsessive self-pity allows the community, even those who oppose the war, to eschew any responsibility for what is going on, to avoid reckoning with the origins of the current catastrophe, and their and our own role as producers of normalcy for this regime, producers of legitimacy through cultural sphere, through education, through all the projects that people have taken refuge in all these years. Thank you very much.
Prosím ještě Jana Veveru o úvodní statement.
Now, Jan Vevera, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to talk from the position of psychiatry, which belongs to the broad range of medicine, and it borders with humanities and other social sciences, and I will draw on some experiments done by social experts. It is worrying how low our restraints against genocide are. We could see it between Russians and Ukrainians, Czechs and Germans, Serbians against Croatians. So we are sometimes willing to kill others. This is very worrying. And no genocide has ever stopped because there was a lack of killers. Our willingness to kill is quite high. Maybe this relates to what Ksenia has talked about the willingness to separate and to divide into two groups, so that it's us against the others. Us means 150 people. That was established by an evolutionary scientist who studied how many relationships can one have, and the number is 150. So this is the number of relationships that we can have. So it's us. And primates are very keen on dividing into two groups. So there are two questions. How many of us will do this, and in what time? So this means that how long will it take for us to make others suffer? We have answers to this thanks to Stanford Prison Experiment that was done by a hosting professor in Prague. Maybe he was here in this site once. I know that in the Vision 97 Foundation invited him to the Czech Republic on several occasions. Stanford Prison Experiment shows that over 6 days, a group of university students can become prison guards who will be able to put bags on other people's heads, and the other group were just other students who pick the shortest straw. So only in 6 days people are able to become brutish. When this experiment was repeated in Abu Ghraib, in practice, in practical terms, there was also physical torture. And what does this experiment tell us? It tells us that under normal circumstances, normal people can start behaving in a way that could not be expected from university students or teachers. It's just in 6 days. So how many of us will be able and willing to do this? And there was another experiment carried out by a social psychologist from the United States, Stanley Milgram. He carried out very well-known experiments based on education. I think you may know it, so I won't describe it in detail. But in a nutshell, the question was how many people will be able to torture other people with electric current under the pretext of helping them to learn better. The setting was that there was a teacher who thought that by electrocuting others motivates them to learn faster. On the other hand, the subject of this experiment was the teacher. There were no students, there were just actors who pretended to be electrocuted. And the result of this study was to see how many students would act on the authorities' guidelines and instructions. The scientists that were present at the experiment told the teachers, you need to electrocute the student. And 2/3 of everyone will be willing to torture others in only just 6 days, because an external authority tells us so. So if we feel pressure from authority, we will be able to and willing to torture others. These were 2 experiments that show that we need some surveillance. Mr. Clausewitz wrote a book about war, where he said that there is uncertainty in the battlefield, in the first line. And in my opinion, that was the case in Bucha, where the soldiers didn't know what was going on. You are covered by the fog of war. This ignorance, this anonymity that allows you to do such things. So, in my opinion, we are now living in a world where we can disperse this fog of war. We can use different surveillance devices, bugged phones, wired phones, and others. And what fascinates me is the self-representation of people in difficult situations. And I am speaking about my colleagues from Afghanistan. There was a ban on taking pictures, but many soldiers just took pictures and they sent them home. And if you focus on anthropology, you could carry out an investigation in this. The situation in Abu Ghraib, it was uncovered thanks to photos that were sent out by soldiers themselves. So this sheds light on the situation. We found out about Bucha online, only a few days after the events happened. And then there is another question. What will be the reaction by the society? When soldiers act in this atrocious manner because they are under the pressure of the circumstances, they are dehumanized, depersonalized, then you kill someone else. And in order to make it more easy to the soldiers are told that the other people are they are presented as rats, cockroaches, or they are just numbers, as in concentration camps. Or you can call the enemy a Nazi or orc. So you take their identity from them. At the same time, the soldiers are frustrated, and I've got bad news for you. The best way to relieve frustration is to slap someone who is below your rank on the social ranking. This is an experiment, and this is the case that is true with other species. When there is a monkey that is on the top of the ranking and it loses something, it relieves its anger on another male that is below his rank. This second male relieves his anger on a female, and so on and so forth. And this is also the case with people. And this is one of the reasons reasons why frustrated soldiers, no matter their nationality, are willing, along with the dehumanization, depersonalization, anonymity, they are willing to act in this way. This could be measured. With animals, this is measured based on the level of stress hormones in the bloodstream. So this is a way how this level decreases. And also this can be controlled. We need to disperse the fog of war. Soldiers of different armies behaved in this manner. It was the case for Czech soldiers. We talked about killing of Czech Germans or Sudeten Germans. Somebody called it a genocide. And what happened in the city of Postoloprty, where the Czech army killed with cold blood 1,000 or 2,000 German inhabitants. And the soldiers were asked why they killed the children, and he answered that I had no choice because I killed their parents. So what can we do with this? We need to shed a light on this, shed a light of justice, represented by other speakers. What happened to the Americans that killed and raped in Vietnam? The massacre in My Lai could be an example. There were hundreds of killed people. The soldiers were brought to justice. It took some time. The government didn't want this to happen, but eventually the soldiers were brought to justice. It was the case with Abu Ghraib. But in Bucha, the culprits were awarded higher ranks. And I think this behavior will go on, but not to finish on a pessimistic note. I see the light at the end of the tunnel in the form that the journalists will be able to show this in their media, and people will be afraid to do this. Mothers of the soldiers will receive emails saying, "We know what your son did." And I think this could be intervention that could have an effect. Well, yes, we hope so, and this is one of the reasons why we do this. Because after the years of our work, then I have a question for you.
When I was a pupil in the late 80s in the 136 Moscow School of José Martí in the wider center of Moscow, it was an ordinary Soviet school, and we had a cabinet full of weapons. And I was taught how to disassemble and reassemble an assault rifle Kalashnikov, AKM. I can still do that. And then that military thing at the end of socialism, at the end of communism, was eventually re-established in Putin's 3 years. Again, the schools in Russia have that. And based on what Jan Vevera just said, there's also a known fact that in the military academies and the cadet schools in Russia, they do not teach humanitarian international law. Would you say that there is something inherently, let's say, expansionist, jingoistic, militarist in Russian culture, let's say, in the last 100 years? There has been a discussion among journalists and historians recently here in Czech Republic where you had very strong pro and very strong counter argument. So what would you say to that?
It's a very voluminous question. Your question is whether there is a discussion of this jingoistic...
There is something inherently...
I mean, I clearly think that there is, obviously, and there is an obsession with militarism and obsession with victory and war as your main modus operandi. I have to quote, unfortunately he passed several years ago, a cultural scholar and a film critic, Daniel Dondurey, who studied Russian values and tropes penetrating and permeating Russian popular culture through TV soap operas and TV series, something which I would never watch, most of you would never watch. He did that difficult job for us, and he sort of singled out values permitting that culture, values or principles. And victory, militarism was very, very important, based on the plots, based on the characters, and characterization of people in those novellas. Or he said that there is very little value accorded to peaceful business competition, but there is a lot of value accorded to snapping a victory and conquering, appropriating somebody's property, appropriating somebody's land. So this is something which really seeps into the very texture of Russian life. What you described with your experience at a Moscow school, I remember that as well, slightly. We didn't have weapons, we jumped over the trenches, and then they sort of dug them up for safety reasons, I guess, and that disappeared for a while. I'm not quite sure whether they have those things at schools, but they do have so-called lessons about important things, talking about the war in Ukraine. And that has been a sinister thing, a sinister new practice, where they really directly brainwash children into sort of the steeples of Russian propaganda, that, you know, we are fighting, Russia is fighting against Nazis, and it's an honorable thing. Students are forced to write letters in support of the soldiers in exchange for a good grade. I mean, a lot of despicable things are going on in the sphere of education.
Lenko, já si vzpomínám na takovou
Lenka, I remember one very tragicomic scene from the period of Maidan Revolution. It was 2 days after the shooting, where the snipers retreated. There were some revolutionaries in the big park next to the parliament, and a big freight cargo car arrived with men with ropes and chains. They came to a memorial of a liberator of Kiev from the Soviet troops, and they were trying to tear this statue down. But then a debate started. Some people say that this soldier was Ukrainian, others said that they were Russian, some said no, this is not the case, that we were liberated, but in the end the statue is still there. So my question is, was the Ukrainian society, knowing that the society in Ukraine is very complex, there are different regions, were they able to separate from this education, this Soviet education in the 80s? And I know that Ukrainian went through the atrocities of Second World War more than Russia. Were they able to separate this majestic militaristic tradition?
K tomu památníku.
Well, speaking about this memorial, I think they should have gotten rid of it at that point, because the fights in Crimea were so atrocious that we couldn't call that liberation. Unfortunately, Ukrainian lives were those that suffered most, so they should have gotten rid of it. But let's move forward. I remember one word that is used by Ukrainians and Russians, mankurt. This is a man without national memory. A person whose memory was erased, and in this blank memory you can now fill this blank memory with whatever you want. And these people were mankursts, in a way. The problems of Russian propaganda are also intertwined with the fact that people will believe anything because they have no memory. They have no notions of what had happened. When we spoke about the big Soviet victory, this was a subject that couldn't be discussed previous previously. People who lived the war in Belarus or in Ukraine didn't see this as a victory because there were so many Ukrainian and Belarusian victims. You will remember war veterans and their condition. No one was allowed to speak about them and about the horrors that happened to them. So only when they were abandoned, they were left behind, could the myth of this patriotic war begin. Of course, there was also a group within the Soviet Union which was not so prone to this memory washing or brainwashing. This was the Western Ukraine. And also the Baltic nations, because these joined, well, I shouldn't be saying joined, they were annexed and occupied in the year 1939, together with the Western Ukraine, which previously was part of Poland. So there were still people living in the Soviet Union who had remembered being part of Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. But in the rest of the territory, the situation was quite different. People to the east from Dnieper only remembered being part of Russia, of the empire, or of the Soviet Union. And we don't always realize this, but the history of Russia is falsified in the same way as the news we are receiving today about what is happening, what has been happening since 2014, and we haven't been preventing this, which explains what is happening right now. We should be protecting not only the territory, but also the information that is circulating. So the debate is ongoing, but this war between Russia and Ukraine could continue for more years, for some 20 more years. But it has already started in 2014, and then in February of this year, everything got so much quicker. I remember interviews with Ukrainians who before that were not antagonistic to Russia, because, for example, these were military officers who studied in Russia, so they didn't remember the things that people in the Western Ukraine did. And only after February did they realize what was happening, did they start using Ukrainian language in their families. Just imagine how profound these changes were. And it was only in 2014 that many Soviet officers became actually Ukrainian officers. It is incredible to observe these changes, these processes, when small kids start identifying differently. For example, there was a priest in Ukraine who told me that in 2014, when arms started to be employed, everyone would need to take sides. And he told me, we already sustained several blows, so we cannot stand this any further. At that time, I was in Spain. I was speaking with my Spanish friends, and I asked them about the civil war in Spain, because to me it didn't seem as a closed chapter. And they told me something similar. They said that they definitely hadn't closed this topic, and that it was so painful that it made them cry. They told me the same thing. When there is a war crime taking place, you need to take sides. You need to decide what is your side. There is no third option. Professor, given your studies and also your personal experience from Afghanistan, can you say, based on your pessimistic introductory remarks, whether these violent or genocidal tendencies can arise in men based on the general situation, be it a civil war like in Afghanistan, so something stemming from the ordinary life, or is it stemming from the impunity we enjoy, for example, in the case of Russian soldiers in Ukraine? I think it is a mixture of both of these factors. The important thing is the view that you have of your opponents. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I was speaking about crimes that are taking place now in Bucha and elsewhere. I was just trying to suggest that these aren't crimes of some human monsters. This would be oversimplified. There are monsters like this in Russia, but the number of such monsters is the same as here in the Czech Republic or in the US. These atrocities are taking place in the context of ordinary people. Maybe this could be interpreted in an optimistic way, because if we change circumstances, we could also change the outcome. For example, when we went to Afghanistan, Dr. Foltin, who often speaks up in media, he also became the spokesperson, and he gave us a training to explain what we could and couldn't do. Because there are other psychological experiments that tell us that once that you cross the first line, you easily cross another line. But if you don't do this, this changes everything. For example, in Bucha, people were entitled to breaking into a home and seizing bread to feed themselves. But they weren't entitled to raping, they weren't entitled to killing people. So they crossed the first line, but we can still interpret this in an optimistic way in order to modify what happens. So you said I was being pessimistic, but I was actually trying to be optimistic. And what was the second part of your question? Well, you said that there was a mixture of two factors. I'm not only speaking about people in uniforms with arms, but maybe also people who are just seeking weapons in order to perpetrate something. Okay, when we speak about Rwanda, there was a huge frustration between the Hutus and the Tutsis based on a long ongoing injustice or sense of injustice and tension. And this tension has been around all the time in the history of humanity, but it doesn't always result in violence. It doesn't always result in nazism. You need to have someone who manages to divide the society and then choose the right way to unite the society. Once actually you are at war, this is something that unites you. In Ukraine, people are now united, probably, or at least in February they were united. So when you hear a person warning against polarizing a society, it is not bad. But when everybody is united, you know that something went wrong, that you are at war. For me, you need to have a look at what the war creates, what the war creates. Milgram explained some interesting things. The victory and the defeat always depend on, in psychological terms, We call this friction. For example, you can have this friction when people in Moscow don't know what exactly happened in Bucha. Or here in the Czech Republic, when there is a new school law, the Minister of Education will not necessarily know what actually happens at schools. And then the second thing is the impunity. I'm sure that my colleagues here are better in history, but, for example, Timothy Snyder pointed out that in countries where conflicts take place, you first need to deprive people of identities, of their IDs, and then you can start killing them. You start by taking the IDs. This happened in Kosovo. So you need to seize the IDs, you need to deprive people of the opportunity to call for justice, and then you can vent your frustration. And it appears that we as people are not willing to challenge our authorities. Yes, I know that there was a huge lesson on that from the year 1935.
Domestic violence. We know that Russian Duma actually annulled an older law against domestic violence. So now there is no way how you can, unless you murder somebody, but beating your wife and beating your kids is considered okay, legal and legal. In the society that is, let's say, not yet totalitarian, but definitely authoritarian, where your individual freedom to do many things, including your political expression, is seriously limited, if not totally limited, when everything is controlled, especially now during the war. Would you consider that abolishing that law and actually systematically ignoring violence, looking the other way, is an acknowledged way for the regime to both let the frustration to not to be concerned into demonstrations, and also to give a false feeling of you being actually individual in charge of at least something, i.e. your apartment and your family?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an important point. I think it's a way of channeling frustration horizontally rather than vertically, because in the absence of democratic elections, all you can do is to sort of vent against, other citizens, people like you or people who are close to you in the family in case of domestic violence. It also gives us a full sense of agency to people who are sort of asserting their masculinity and subjectivity and agency this way. I think it's really an important device. I think it's kind of understudied, and I would like to look more into that. But there is also, of course, a conservative debate supported and prompted by the Russian Orthodox Church that claims that introducing criminal punishment for domestic violence is a serious affront to traditional values, whatever that means. We know that if you look at Russian society sociologically, it's not a traditional society. The rate of divorces, the rate of orphaned kids, kids who are not orphaned, but they're given over to state institutions, orphanages with parents who are alive but incapable of taking care of them, is staggering. And we have a gamut of social problems that really do not enable us to talk about this society as a traditional society. And yet there is this rhetorical cloud which has been going on for many years now, that you cannot interfere in the family. This is sacred. This is something where the government and the state should not have their hand. The government effectively has their hand everywhere by now, right? So this is, of course, completely cynical and hypocritical, but I think it functions as a sort of, what's the word for that? A channel to vent and to get rid of some of the frustrations that otherwise would be in the street or in criminality in the streets or against the regime in certain ways.
Já k tomu možná mám trošku jiná data, ale
maybe I have different data, and as for domestic violence, and this is a topic of interest of psychiatry. What the society expects from us sometimes is to decide when there is a risk of a patient for their surroundings. Maybe sometimes psychiatry can be abused for this, and in Russia psychiatry has been abused to persecute dissidents. But this is not the case in the Czech Republic. Even though this sometimes happens, sometimes we decide that a patient needs to stay hospitalized against their will because they are aggressive against their own personality, they are suicidal, and sometimes, that is more seldom, that their families could be at risk. We have carried out many different studies on what would be the predicting elements of violent behavior with patients, and the main factor is that they were victims of violence in their childhood. So childhood abuse is one of the factors that could imply that the person would become aggressive and violent. And you know, sometimes using common sense, you could say that you, as a child, could see that violence against children was not good, so you will not use it. But sometimes people copy it when they are adult. Lenka.
Several languages, but I am thinking that, you know, there is a sort of circular structure to that violence if we talk about violence in the family, because if you look at, I think his name was Lenny Athens, the criminologist who studied the system of socialization into brutality or socialization into violence, and he called it violentization. There were several stages. One of them was when a child was exposed to violence at home, you know, parents abusing each other. Violence at school was another stage, when you are bullied by your peers. Then when you have a significant adult who socializes you into taking violence as the main means and way of solving conflicts. You are a boy, you have to strike back, don't be a sissy. And then this is taken further and further, and actually Athens looked at ways that hardened criminals ended up where they were committing crimes, and also at socialization of soldiers into certain brutality, where you have to dissociate from your enemy, from your victim or target, right? And so you socialize soldiers the same way as hardened criminals are socialized, but you stop one step before violence becomes your necessary tool for every situation. You know, with violence being as prevalent as it is in Russian society, in families, at schools, in all institutions, it's of course a very sort of knee-jerk reaction for these soldiers to resort to violence when they feel frustrated, if I understood your point correctly, if they feel scared, or if there is no guidance to what they have to perform in Ukraine. But at the same time, we absolutely know for a fact that those veterans coming back to their families bring that violence back into the families and into the streets. Now, given the economic collapse, which is imminent, we are to expect a surge in the number of violence in the families and violence in the streets. So this is a sort of a system which feeds itself like a snake biting its tail, I think, and it's a horrible problem that, unfortunately, there are very few civil institutions in place left in this society to take care of the victims and to prevent that, because they have been ousted or, you know, declared foreign agents. Who's going to take care of that problem now?
Yeah, well, it's known that domestic violence happens to be the wall for at least for the men in traditional societies, for the very bad things that are going on around the world. Lenko, já jsem se chtěl zeptat ve světle té budu slušný, poněkud pomílené.
In light of the report of Amnesty International that was presented and published in September, where they criticized the Russian army and the way that Russian army uses facilities that should not be used in war waging. For example, evacuated schools. The schools have been closed since 25th of February, and we know that they are used for military purposes, but they are not called as such. because you do not wage war by saying, let's leave the city and let's fight on the countryside. And also we have mentioned Geneva Conventions. They are very strict. Sometimes they are very practical, namely the Convention of 1949. So my question is, to what extent the Ukrainian political leadership and military leadership is aware of the fact, and it is always the case in this complex war, well, it's aware of the fact of violation of rules and habits in war by the defenders. We have seen cases of such violations in the Second World War, carried out by the Allies, the United States. This is essential, because to tolerate this is problematic, not only in debates, but also from the point of view of the effects that it could have on society. Because in times of despair, there is violence targeted against civilian sector. So my question is, can the Ukrainian political military leadership deal with this?
You're completely right. When it comes to this, under international law and so on, this should be addressed by professors such as the speaker in the previous panel, and not just by anyone discussing over a cup of coffee or over a beer, because these people don't know the rules of war. Then they don't know the Hague Convention or the Geneva Convention, they just guess. And only yesterday did I speak about the fact that schools shouldn't be used as military bases. But that is the case when children are there. The Geneva Convention defines much more interesting rules than what we read in our newspapers. Also, you shouldn't use medical cars, you shouldn't use ambulances, but it is always specified. It specifies that you shouldn't be using these ambulances when there are soldiers in them. Speaking about the political and military management in Ukraine, things are quite clear. Ukraine needs help from the West, and therefore Ukraine is aware that they need to respect or obey the rules, and the Geneva Convention and other conventions are part of them. Ukraine tries to train soldiers, not only commanders, but also general soldiers, about these conventions. I am aware of this because I know people who carry out these trainings. Recently, some 21 videos, each lasting 30 minutes, were issued explaining individual principles of international humanitarian law. For example, the principle of distinction, and so on and so forth. I forgot the name of the other principle. But basically, everything is explained using videos, using apps, and so on. And organizations such as Geneva Call are present in Ukraine, who have mobile phone apps that will train you, and you can also undergo a test to know if you are interpreting things well. I also know a person who goes to meet soldiers and explain military law. This is very interesting because it leads to debates about what seems logical, and in the end, the legal principles are logical if understood correctly. Also, people show individual moments from real-life conflicts and let soldiers see these case studies to see what is allowed, what is not allowed, what to do when dealing with war prisoners, and so on. So the Ukrainian army definitely does this. And to expand on what was said by the doctor, the psychiatrist, we are speaking here about soldiers, about their reactions, about their behavior. And of course, we have long known that our psychological nature changes during wars. But what we see in Ukraine is something more, something else. These are not just crimes perpetrated by ordinary Russian soldiers. There are also other moments which would maybe go under the heading of crimes against humanity. And I'm not quite sure that professional Russian army actually perpetrated all of those crimes we have seen live. Maybe these were other troops, and I wonder, a question that remains unchecked, undiscussed, and this is the question of lists of people that the Russian forces, but not army forces, lists of people that arrive in different cities. And we have lists of Ukrainian activists, Ukrainian politicians from towns such as Irpin or Bucha. And we have cases when people knew who they were looking for. They were looking for individual names, individual addresses. For example, people from Mariupol who were given notification from the Ukrainian intelligence to leave because they were looked for. So I wonder how this happened. I don't think this arises from an ongoing stress, from the fact that you haven't seen your wife for quite a while. I think that this is maybe targeted action, but maybe we will have to deal with this later. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our guests, Alice Víchová, Ksenia Poluektova-Krimer, and also Jan Vevera. Thank you for being here, and let's meet here in a year's time, maybe on a more optimistic note.